Caroline Bennett had spent 22 years setting the Bennett family's dinner table. Tonight, she would discover that after all those years, they still hadn't saved her a seat. Not literally, not yet, though that moment was coming too. What she was about to discover, in front of everyone she loved, was something quieter and far more painful, that after 2 decades of showing up, of remembering birthdays and dietary restrictions and every small detail this family never remembered about her, she was still, in their eyes, exactly what she had always been to them. Hired help who happened to share their last name. She smiled as she reached for the small wrapped box Vanessa handed her, keeping her expression pleasant and composed the way she had trained herself to do at every one of these gatherings for over 2 decades. Having no idea that in 12 days, a lawyer named Arthur Callahan would read a letter that undid every single thing about to happen at this table tonight. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Caroline met Daniel Bennett at 24 at a mutual friend's engagement party, where he spent most of the evening asking her questions about her own life rather than talking about his family's business, a quality she found rare enough at the time to fall in love with almost immediately. What she didn't yet understand, standing in that crowded backyard laughing at something he'd said, was that the same quiet, careful nature that made Daniel easy to fall in love with would later become the same quality that made him almost impossible to rely on whenever his mother or sister crossed a line. Harold noticed this about his son far earlier than anyone realized, and though he never mentioned it directly to Caroline, he would bring it up, quietly and without warning, many years later, in a letter nobody expected him to write. The first time Caroline understood exactly where she stood in this family, she was 26 years old, sitting at Judith's dining table during her second Thanksgiving as Daniel's wife. She reached for the salt to season the mashed potatoes she had spent all afternoon preparing, and Judith smiled at her politely before gently stopping her hand. "Actually, dear," Judith said, "in this family we season after tasting. It's just how we've always done it." Nobody at the table looked up. Nobody said anything at all. Caroline quietly set the salt back down, smiled, and finished her plate without another word, and it would take her several more years to fully understand that the moment had never really been about salt. A Christmas several years later offered another small example of the same pattern repeating itself. Caroline had spent 2 full days preparing a dish her own mother used to make, something she rarely shared with anyone because it felt personal to her in a way most family recipes didn't. Judith tasted it, paused for a moment too long, and said only that it was interesting, a word she reserved specifically for things she had no intention of complimenting further. Vanessa didn't even try it, waving it off with a comment about watching her figure during the holidays, though she went on to have seconds of everything else on the table. Nobody at the table noticed Caroline quietly moving the dish closer to herself for the rest of the evening, eating it alone in small, private bites, the only person at that table who seemed to think it deserved to be finished. Vanessa's version of the same lesson came sharper and more direct, delivered a few years later at a birthday dinner for one of the cousins. Caroline had worn a dress she'd bought on sale, proud of how it fit, and Vanessa looked her over for a beat too long before saying, loudly enough for the table to hear, that it was nice Caroline could still find things that fit off the clearance rack. A few people laughed. Someone quickly changed the subject to the weather, the way this family always did whenever a comment landed a little too precisely. Caroline laughed along too, because that was easier than the alternative, and she told herself, driving home that night, that she was simply too sensitive, a thought she would repeat to herself many more times over the coming years. Harold never once made her feel that way. Caroline still remembered the year her own father passed away, when Harold, a man of very few words even under ordinary circumstances, called her the morning of the funeral just to ask if she needed anything at all, groceries, a ride, someone to simply sit with her. Nobody else in the family called that morning. When Harold's own wife died several years later, it was Caroline who sat beside him at the reception long after Judith and Vanessa had drifted off into other conversations. And Harold had turned to her at one point and said, quietly, that she reminded him of his late wife in one particular way, that she never seemed to need anyone's permission to be kind. 18 years before that final birthday dinner, Harold's furniture company came within weeks of collapsing entirely after a business partner disappeared with company funds, and Caroline learned about it almost by accident, overhearing a tense phone call between Daniel and his father that Daniel never intended for her to hear. She sat with the number for 2 days before she said anything to anyone. Then she called Harold directly, told him exactly what she had, and asked him one simple question, whether it would be enough. Harold went quiet on the phone for a long moment before answering. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, and he asked her, more than once, whether she understood what she was offering, whether she truly understood she might never see a cent of it back if things didn't recover. Caroline told him she understood completely, and that she wasn't doing it to be repaid. He never asked why she would do this for a family that had never made her feel like she belonged to it. He simply said thank you twice, and then he asked her carefully whether she wanted anyone else to know. She said no, and explained, a little embarrassed, that she didn't want it to change how anyone treated her, that if kindness only counted when it came with a price tag attached, she wasn't sure it was really kindness at all. Harold went quiet again after that, and years later he would tell Arthur Callahan that this was the exact moment he understood who Caroline truly was, long before the rest of his family ever bothered to look closely enough to see it themselves. He kept his promise to her for 18 years. What almost nobody in the family knew, and what Caroline herself would not learn until much later, was that 3 months before that final birthday dinner, Harold had discovered something about Vanessa during a routine conversation with his accountant, something he chose not to mention to a single member of his family, not even to Arthur Callahan at first. He simply asked a few quiet follow-up questions of his own, made a note in a private file, and said nothing further about it to anyone at all. Whatever he had learned, he carried it with him into that final birthday dinner, watching his daughter across the table with an expression nobody thought to read too closely at the time. The evening of that dinner began the way most Bennett family gatherings began, with pleasant small talk that carefully avoided anything real. There was a brief, awkward silence when someone mentioned a cousin who hadn't been invited, quickly smoothed over by Judith redirecting the conversation to the roast. An uncle asked Caroline, not unkindly but without much thought either, whether she'd ever considered getting a real job now that the kids were grown, and when Caroline said she'd worked part-time at a school for years, he nodded vaguely and moved on to ask Daniel about his golf handicap instead, the question already forgotten. Vanessa laughed a little too loudly at her own joke about the wine pairing, the kind of laugh that filled a room without actually being funny. Daniel sat beside Caroline, quiet as usual, occasionally glancing toward his mother and sister with an expression Caroline had learned not to read too much into over the years, though tonight, for reasons she couldn't quite name, something in his posture seemed tighter than usual, his hand resting a little too firmly around his glass. When Vanessa suggested reviving the family gift exchange, an old tradition that had quietly become something else entirely over recent years, Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For half a second, he opened his mouth as though he might say something, might suggest skipping the tradition this year, might do anything at all to spare his wife whatever was coming. Then Judith clapped her hands together with delight at the idea. And the moment passed, and Daniel closed his mouth again and reached for his wine instead. He would think about that half-second many times in the months that followed, the half-second where he almost became a different kind of husband and chose, instead, to stay exactly the one he had always been. Caroline opened the small box to find a dish rag and a stained apron folded neatly inside, and the table did not go quiet. It filled instead with easy, comfortable laughter, the kind of laughter people use when they've long since stopped noticing their own cruelty. One of the cousins laughed a half-second too long, realized nobody else was still laughing, and covered it badly with a cough. Someone else immediately asked whether anyone wanted more wine. The way this family always reached for a distraction, the moment a room grew even slightly uncomfortable. Vanessa raised her glass and offered a toast about certain people marrying into a family expecting quite a lot while contributing very little in return. And she never said Caroline's name, though every single person at that table understood exactly who she meant. Someone laughed a beat too hard and then glanced away quickly, as though embarrassed by their own laughter. Caroline forced a smile onto her face, the same practiced smile she had perfected over 2 decades, folded the apron carefully back into the box as though it were a perfectly lovely gift, and said nothing at all. Daniel looked down at his plate. His hand tightened around his napkin under the table, out of sight, and for one long moment he genuinely believed he was finally going to say something, finally going to tell his sister that the joke wasn't funny and had never once been funny. The words even reached the back of his throat. Then he looked up, caught his mother's expression, the same expression she'd worn his entire childhood whenever conflict threatened to disrupt a family gathering, and he swallowed the words instead, the way he always had. He would replay that exact moment countless times in the months ahead, wondering what might have changed if he had simply let the sentence finish leaving his mouth. What almost nobody at that table noticed, because almost nobody was watching him in that particular moment, was Harold quietly setting down his napkin and rising from his chair, excusing himself with a simple explanation that he needed a moment to rest. He did not confront his daughter or his granddaughter for what they had just done. That was never his way. He walked calmly to his study, closed the door, and called Arthur Callahan directly, confirming in a brief, businesslike conversation that everything they had discussed remained exactly as he wanted it. When he returned to the table a few minutes later, he smiled warmly and said he had simply needed to catch his breath, an explanation nobody thought to question, and the dinner continued as though nothing significant had happened at all. Vanessa caught Daniel alone in the kitchen later that evening while the others said their goodbyes, and told him, half joking, that Caroline could stand to laugh at herself a little more. Daniel almost said something then too, standing there with a stack of plates in his hands, but he only shrugged and said Caroline was fine, that she never let anything bother her for long. Vanessa nodded, satisfied by an answer that let her stop thinking about it entirely, and went back to the living room without another word. Daniel stood alone in the kitchen a moment longer than necessary, staring at nothing in particular, before carrying the plates to the sink and rejoining everyone else as though the conversation had never happened at all. On the drive home, Caroline sat quietly with the box still in her lap, and Daniel drove in silence for several minutes before finally speaking. He said he was sorry, the way he always said he was sorry, an apology that acknowledged the discomfort without nomming what his sister had actually done. Caroline turned to look out the window and said, quietly, that sorry was starting to feel like the only word he knew how to use in this family. Daniel didn't answer right away. When he finally did, he admitted, almost too quietly to hear over the engine, that he had almost said something at the table tonight, and Caroline asked him, without turning back around, why he hadn't. He didn't have an answer for her, and the rest of the drive passed in silence. 3 weeks later, Harold Bennett passed away peacefully in his sleep, and the family gathered again, this time for a funeral rather than a birthday. Caroline found herself, as always, quietly managing the logistics nobody else wanted to handle, confirming caterers, printing programs, finding a seat for a great-aunt who insisted on sitting apart from everyone else without explaining why. Judith moved through the day with a rigid, composed grief, thanking guests by name, and accepting condolences with practiced poise, while Vanessa spent much of the reception speaking in hushed tones with relatives about matters that had far more to do with the estate than with mourning, occasionally catching herself, and adjusting her expression back into something more appropriately somber whenever someone glanced her way. During the reception, an older woman Caroline didn't recognize stood quietly near the back of the room, dressed simply, holding a small bouquet she never seemed to find the right moment to set down. When Caroline approached her out of simple politeness, the woman introduced herself as an old friend of Harold's late wife, someone who had lost touch with the family years earlier and had only just heard the news through a mutual acquaintance. Their conversation was brief and unremarkable, though a distant cousin who caught only the tail end of it later mentioned to Vanessa, in a hushed and vaguely thrilled tone, that he'd seen Caroline speaking to a mysterious stranger nobody in the family could place. Within days, a rumor began circulating that this woman might be connected to some hidden complication in Harold's estate, a rumor Vanessa repeated more than once at family gatherings that week, always careful to frame it as simple curiosity rather than gossip, though it would ultimately lead nowhere at all. 10 days after the funeral, Arthur Callahan requested that the entire family gather at his office for the reading of the will, and the formality of his message set off a quiet wave of speculation throughout the family. Judith assumed the estate would pass primarily to Daniel, as tradition in families like theirs usually dictated. Vanessa had already begun quietly researching property values near the family's summer home, certain her closeness to her father had earned her the largest share. Caroline expected nothing at all and told herself, as she always did, that expecting nothing was the safest way to avoid disappointment, though a small, quiet part of her kept returning to the memory of Harold rising from the table that final night, and the odd, unreadable look on his face when he returned. The morning of the reading arrived cold and gray, and the family sat together in an uncomfortable silence broken only by Vanessa checking her phone and Judith clearing her throat every few minutes out of nervous habit rather than necessity. Daniel sat beside Caroline but didn't reach for her hand, and Caroline noticed, filed it away quietly, and said nothing, though she caught him glancing at their joined armrest more than once, his fingers twitching slightly as though considering it before pulling back again. When Arthur Callahan finally entered, closed the door, and began reading, the first several minutes unfolded exactly as expected, small sentimental items distributed among various relatives, nothing suggesting the larger revelation still waiting further down the page. Judith received a modest, respectful sum, considerably less than she had quietly planned her future around, and her composure, so carefully maintained until that point, began to visibly falter, her hands tightening around each other in her lap. Then Arthur Callahan paused, adjusted his glasses, and explained that before reading Vanessa's portion of the will, Harold had left specific instructions requiring a separate document to be read aloud first. He opened a second folder and revealed that 3 months before his death, Harold had learned, through a conversation with his accountant, that Vanessa had quietly inquired about the legal steps required to gain financial power of attorney over her father's assets, framing the inquiry to the accountant as concern for Harold's declining health, though she had never once raised the subject directly with Harold himself. Harold had written a short, calm note addressing this discovery, stating simply that he understood his daughter's fear of losing control, but that trust, once quietly tested behind someone's back, was difficult to hand over freely again. Vanessa's face drained of color as the note was read aloud, and for a long moment nobody in the room said anything at all. She opened her mouth as though to explain herself, then closed it again, seeming to realize there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make the moment worse. Judith turned toward her daughter with an expression that mixed disbelief with something closer to embarrassment, though she said nothing either, apparently deciding this was not the room to address it in. Her bequest, when Arthur Callahan finally read it, consisted of an old car kept in storage and a set of dishes that had belonged to Harold's mother, considerably less than she had spent weeks quietly planning around, though by that point, given what had just been read aloud, almost no one in the room was truly surprised. Arthur Callahan then turned to the final section of the document, and the room held its breath without anyone deciding to do so together. He explained that the majority of Harold's estate, including full ownership of the family business, had been placed into a trust to be administered entirely by Caroline Bennett. He read Harold's own words directly from the page, explaining that this decision came from a debt he felt he could never fully repay, owed to the only person in this family who had ever helped him without expecting anything in return, and who had never once, across 18 years, mentioned it to another living soul. Then Arthur Callahan opened a final sealed letter addressed directly to Caroline, and began reading Harold's own words aloud to the room. He described the night nearly 2 decades earlier when Caroline quietly saved his company from collapse, and he wrote that he had spent years watching her endure quiet disrespect from his own wife and daughter, without ever once revealing what she had done for this family. Near the end of the letter, Harold had written a single line that Arthur Callahan read slowly, deliberately, letting it settle fully into the room before continuing. "The easiest person to overlook," Harold had written, "is usually the one holding the whole family together." He added just beneath it that respect is never revealed by how a person treats their equals, but by how they treat the one person they've decided has nothing left to offer them. The room did not erupt into shouting. It settled instead into a stunned, uneven quiet, the kind filled with small human details rather than dramatic gestures. Judith stared down at her folded hands, her face pale, saying nothing. Vanessa exhaled sharply, almost a laugh, though nothing about her expression suggested humor. And Daniel, for the first time that entire evening, reached over and took Caroline's hand, holding it the way he hadn't quite managed to at the dinner table weeks earlier. A small, quiet gesture that arrived considerably later than Caroline might have once hoped for, though it arrived all the same. What almost nobody in the room expected, including Daniel himself, was that Arthur Callahan had one additional item to deliver that day, separate from the will itself. A short handwritten letter addressed specifically to Daniel that Harold had written in the same sitting as Caroline's. Arthur Callahan handed it to Daniel privately after the reading concluded, once the rest of the family had filed out of the office. Daniel read it alone in the hallway, his hands unsteady, as Harold's familiar handwriting laid out, plainly and without cruelty, that he had watched his son stay quiet through moments that deserved a voice for over 20 years, and that he hoped Daniel would use whatever time he had left with Caroline learning to be the husband who spoke up rather than the one who apologized afterward. Daniel folded the letter carefully, put it in his coat pocket, and didn't mention its existence to anyone, including Caroline, for several more weeks. Caroline herself sat down with Arthur Callahan privately a few days later, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened in that office, and she finally asked him directly how long Harold had actually been planning all of this, half expecting to hear it had come together quickly in his final weeks. Arthur set down his coffee and told her that Harold had first raised the idea of restructuring his will nearly 3 years earlier, long before his health had shown any real signs of decline, and that he had revised the language of it slowly and carefully over several separate visits, never once rushing any part of the decision. He told her that Harold had spoken about her often during those private sessions, always with the same quiet certainty that she was the one member of this family who genuinely deserved to be trusted with something this significant. Caroline found a strange comfort in hearing this secondhand, a confirmation that Harold's decision hadn't been some final, isolated impulse, but the result of years of careful, considered thought. In the months that followed, Caroline made a series of decisions that surprised people who thought they understood her, including, in certain ways, herself. She ensured Judith remained financially comfortable, arranging an allowance beyond what the will alone required. She offered Vanessa a genuine working role within the company, built on actual responsibility rather than inherited entitlement, an offer Vanessa didn't immediately accept, though she didn't reject it outright either, and the two of them settled, slowly and without much conversation about it, into something that wasn't quite reconciliation but wasn't quite estrangement either. Caroline also promoted a longtime employee named Frank Delgado, a man who had quietly kept the company running during its darkest weeks 18 years earlier and had never once been meaningfully acknowledged by the family for it. When Caroline told him about the promotion in person, Frank sat quietly for a long moment before admitting that he had assumed, after Harold's passing, that whoever took over would eventually bring in someone younger, someone from outside the company, the way these transitions so often go. Caroline told him plainly that Harold had mentioned him by name more than once over the years, always with real respect, and that she intended to run this company the way Harold actually would have wanted it run, not the way people assumed a Bennett would run it. Frank nodded, cleared his throat, and thanked her twice, the second time considerably quieter than the first. Vanessa took nearly 2 months to respond to Caroline's offer, and when she finally did, she showed up unannounced at the office rather than calling, standing awkwardly in the doorway for a moment before asking whether the offer still stood. Caroline told her it did. Vanessa admitted, quietly and without her usual sharpness, that she didn't fully understand why Caroline was offering it at all after everything, and Caroline told her simply that she wasn't interested in punishing anyone, only in building something worth being part of, and that whether Vanessa chose to be part of it was entirely up to her. Vanessa started the following month in a junior role far beneath anything she had once imagined for herself, and though the early weeks were stiff and occasionally tense, something in her seemed to soften slightly with every small task she actually finished on her own. 6 months into the role, Vanessa closed her first client deal entirely on her own, a modest contract with a regional retailer that nonetheless represented real, demonstrable growth for the company. She mentioned it to Caroline almost sheepishly, half expecting the moment to be brushed past the way most of her efforts had been brushed past for most of her life. Instead, Caroline told the rest of the team about it at the next staff meeting, crediting Vanessa by name in front of everyone, the same way Harold had once quietly credited people who actually earned it. Vanessa didn't quite know what to do with the attention at first, sitting stiffly through the applause, though she found herself, driving home that evening, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel in that building at all, something close to genuinely belonging somewhere. Daniel's reconciliation with his own conscience proved slower and considerably messier than anyone might have hoped for, including Caroline. There was no single dramatic conversation where he apologized fully for 2 decades of silence. Instead, there were smaller moments. A Sunday dinner several months later where Judith made an offhand comment about Caroline's new responsibilities being a lot for someone with her background to handle, and Daniel, without raising his voice, told his mother plainly that Caroline's background had saved this family's business twice now, once quietly and once in front of a lawyer, and that he was done pretending otherwise. Judith went silent, clearly startled, and the table sat in an uncomfortable quiet not unlike the one from that final birthday dinner months earlier, though this time it was Daniel's words hanging in the air rather than Vanessa's. Caroline said nothing, but reached under the table and found his hand herself this time. Judith, for her part, never managed a full apology either, though there were signs, small and imperfect, that something in her had shifted. Around the anniversary of Harold's death, she stopped by Caroline's office unannounced, sat down across from her, and started more than once with the words, "I think I owe you," before trailing off and glancing down at her hands instead. Caroline waited, giving her the space to finish, but the sentence never quite arrived. Judith eventually asked instead whether Caroline needed help going through some of Harold's old papers, a question that meant something closer to an apology than either of them said out loud, and Caroline said yes, and the two of them spent the rest of that afternoon quietly sorting through old files together, saying very little, though something in the silence between them felt different than it ever had before. On the first anniversary of Harold's death, Caroline drove out alone to the cemetery on the edge of town, something she hadn't told anyone in the family she planned to do. She stood at his grave for a long while without saying very much out loud, and what she did say wasn't a thank you exactly, though it carried some of that inside it. She told him that the company was doing fine, that Frank had turned out to be exactly as steady as Harold always said he was, that Judith had started slowly, to soften in small ways nobody would have predicted a year earlier, and that Daniel had finally started saying things out loud that used to just sit quietly behind his eyes. She didn't tell him it had all worked out perfectly, because it hadn't, not entirely, and she suspected he wouldn't have wanted to hear a tidier version of the truth than the one that had actually happened. Caroline stopped waiting for the sentence to complete itself. She understood, better than most, that some people simply never find the rest of that sentence, and that waiting for it was its own quiet kind of surrender she was no longer willing to make. A year after the will reading, the company Harold built looked recognizably his, even as Caroline steadily reshaped it, expanding modestly into new markets with Frank Delgado's decades of experience guiding the practical decisions and her own patient temperament guiding everything else. It was not a story that ended in dramatic revenge or a tidy, complete reconciliation. Vanessa remained complicated. Judith remained partly unreachable. Daniel remained a work in progress. Caroline stopped needing any of it to resolve itself neatly, because she had finally been given something that mattered considerably more than a clean ending: the simple, undeniable knowledge that at least one person in that family had truly seen her all along. The strange thing about families isn't that they sometimes choose the wrong heir. It's that they often fail to recognize the right one until it's far too late to have told them so directly. Harold Bennett spent the final months of his life quietly correcting an imbalance nobody else in his family had even noticed existed, not through confrontation, but through the one form of truth his family could never successfully talk their way around. Caroline never asked to be vindicated. She simply kept being exactly who she had always been, patient and steady in a house full of people who mistook her patience for something smaller than it truly was. And in the end, the truth arrived anyway, quietly, the way the truth so often does, long after everyone stopped expecting it to come at all. Perhaps that's the part of this story worth sitting with longest, not the will, and not even the letter, but the simple, uncomfortable question it leaves behind for anyone willing to ask it honestly of their own family. Somewhere in every household, there is likely a person quietly doing the work nobody else wants to do, absorbing small cruelties nobody else thinks to notice. And the real test was never whether that person deserved recognition. It was always whether anyone else in the room was paying close enough attention to offer it, before a lawyer had to read it aloud instead. If this story affected you the way it affected us while putting it together, tell us in the comments below whether you've ever been the one holding your own family together without ever being fully seen for it, or whether you've watched someone else carry that weight quietly for years. Let us know where you're watching from today. Share this with someone who might need a story like Caroline's right now. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next real story about family, patience, and the truth that eventually finds its way into the light.